Through.
Good afternoon. A question for Dr. Judy. What importance do you attach to the fact that you are multilingual? Or what techniques or skills, professional skills can or must be developed and acquired in order to be more competitive? There's a lot of noise, a lot of interference.
Dr. Judy, did you hear the question?
Dr. Judy, ¿escuchó?
I heard it.
Yes.
Yes, let me respond to that. I think that that multilingual facility is extraordinarily important. Certainly in our country, we need to place much more emphasis upon that. Those individuals who have the facility to speak and to move comfortably and confidently around the world and in many different social contexts and language environments are at a great advantage. So I endorse the position of the caller.
Very good. Please follow up, Mr. Brass.
I just am struck by the thought that all three of us on the program today are multilingual. My background is German. My children are learning Indonesian. I support the view. It is critical, not just from the point of view of understanding different cultures. But one of the pieces of research that's been done in recent times demonstrate that if you do have more than one language, your facility to learn others is increased. So it's part of this capacity to learn that you get at an early age.
Excellent. Thank you. Yes, sir.
I just want to add that sometimes it's not just language, but it's a good skill, but also the ability to get involved in a different culture. My experience here in the U.S. has been that even though you can speak well, you need to understand other people's mind, other people's points of view. So the ability to get involved in another environment, I think it's a very valuable skill to have.
Excellent point. Our next call this morning comes from the Organization of American States in Washington, D.C. Your question, please.
Hi, good morning. I noticed that several of the speakers talked about the need for more education. To me, education is a very broad phenomenon. It has to do with learning, and it has to do with schooling. As far as I'm concerned, one of the most important aspects of learning has to do with influencing attitudes and changing behaviors. I think it was the gentleman from Australia who mentioned a few moments ago that there was a need for a willingness to learn and an understanding of how to learn. Do you have any suggestions on the panel of how one can address in a classroom or even in a country situation the kind of information you need to pass on to people about their changing their attitudes and influencing their behavior? What are some of the topics or the ways in which this can be handled?
Okay, very good. We're going to start with Mr. Brass and then Dr. Judy, if you'd be thinking about a follow-up, please.
I can give one example that I'm aware of. Edward de Bono has, for a number of years, been a world authority on this question of thinking and learning. And he's developed an entire educational curriculum which can be implemented from the beginning of school, called CORT, which is about the process of learning to learn and learning to think. There are many other examples, but that's one that I've had some experience with, which is actually practiced in many places. It's a developed curriculum.
Very good. Dr. Judy, please.
I'm not a pedagogue, but I certainly endorse the idea that strengthening the motivation, one, and the ability to learn throughout one's life is perhaps the most important thing that a parent or a teacher can give a child in their childhood. So the need to do it is clear. I think a great deal of it rests with what happens in the home, I must say, and whatever can be done to strengthen that should be done.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you both. Our next call comes from the Servicio Nacional de Aprendizaje Comercial in Porto Alegre. The question, please.
Buenas tardes. Good afternoon. I would like to change a little bit the focus of the question, and I'm going to talk a little bit about employment. The crisis in Ecuador in Brazil has generated many problems because it started because of Mercosur, and Brazil is one of the emerging countries that, when they have strategic alliances with other countries, have a problem of generating employment. And although their interests seem to be different, that is our problem. So what comments can you make?
Mr. Avalos?
Well, it's kind of a tough question, but I will be happy to elaborate later. I think we have to go back to education. I mean, employment problems have always been related to this skill situation. I really think that we need to emphasize and re-emphasize this situation, because with the growing population in Asian countries, for example, most of them are low-skilled people. So if we are having problems now, they may be even harder in the future. So if we want to solve these problems for once, now we need to get a more developed labor force.
Very good. Dr. Judy, would you mind tagging on to that, please?
Yeah, I would emphasize the importance of macroeconomic policy, good macroeconomic policy, the proper management of fiscal and monetary affairs, and for that matter also a rational exchange rate regime. That's well beyond the topic of this particular program, but a mismanagement at that level, at the macroeconomic level, can negate much good work that is done in the area of human capital development and so on.
Thank you, Dr. Judy. And our last question for this segment comes from the Servicios Educativos Integrados in Toluca, Mexico. And the question, please.
La pregunta, México, adelante.
Do we have the caller on the line? Okay. All right, gentlemen, thank you very much for your questions, and the audience for your questions, rather. And we would like to now begin with Module 2, in which Mr. Brass will talk to us about the type of future we should work towards creating in our organizations.
This is a presentation about work. For many people, the word work is synonymous with the word employment. This is not how dictionaries see things, however. The concise Oxford Dictionary has more than 30 definitions of work, and it's only the 6th definition, employment, especially the opportunity of earning money by labour, which equates to employment. The first definition of work in the Oxford Dictionary is expenditure of energy, striving, application of effort or exertion to a purpose. But it's the processes of employment and jobs which continue to attract most attention whenever the future of work is discussed. I hope to widen this discussion considerably for 2 reasons. First, because jobs as we've known them are disappearing, and second, because there is increasing concern about the social and environmental consequences of employment. But I get ahead of myself. For most of my life, I thought I knew what work was. As a child, work was what big people did. While kids were allowed to play most of the time, adults had to work most of the time. My dad worked in a church, my mum worked at home, and almost every adult I knew had a job of some kind. As a student, work was my ultimate goal. I knew that if I studied hard and learnt all the right things, I would get a good job. And I was sure that the harder I studied, the better would be the job I would get. At the university level, it was work that provided my first car. Though this was a different kind of work, I knew that doing deliveries for a local grocer was only temporary, just to get me enough money to get my wheels. After I graduated, I got my first real job. It came with a job title, a business card, and a regular as clockwork salary. For the next 20 years, I went to work, did my job, earned my wage, and thought I'd discovered the meaning of life. During those 20 years, I also bought a house, acquired a mortgage, got married, had 3 children, and switched from being a school teacher to a corporate executive. I'd arrived, and I was just like the adults I'd admired as a child. I had taken my place in the world of work. Like many others in my generation, there are 2 reasons why I began to seriously question whether this is really what work and life was meant to be. First, I noticed myself steadily working longer and longer hours during this time. This is a trend in almost every country of the world. In Australia, for example, average weekly working hours for full-time employees have increased by 7 hours over the past decade. Despite a variety of attempts around the world to limit working hours, this trend gives no indication of slowing down, let alone reversing. As well, I and others found our job responsibilities increasing and support staff decreasing. For me, home became little more than a place to recuperate and to exchange dirty clothes for clean ones. I began to see more of some flight attendants than my own children. Second, many people I knew and respected began losing their jobs. The corporation I worked for, and almost all others, were downsizing, and in the process excluding more and more people from access to work. I began to see families and communities break down, and as a result, some adults and children I knew tragically committed suicide. The challenge that I've set for myself today is to have all of you thinking differently about the meaning of work in your lives, for your employees, and perhaps even for your community and the world. I intend to identify 3 key trends in the world of work. A trend towards finding meaning and purpose in individual working lives and away from simply having a job. A trend towards smaller scale, local production and away from impersonal global corporations. And thirdly, a trend towards lifetime contribution and away from the retirement or the artificial curtailment of productive lives. More importantly, I intend to show that these are in fact converging trends and to identify their point of convergence. My hope is that if you start to think about work differently, you and your organisations will also begin to do work differently. Your organisations will perhaps be able to anticipate changes that you may have to inevitably make in the future. My remarks are based on the assumption that most, if not all of us, feel uneasy about the future of work. This may be because we seem to be working harder and harder with little improvement in our quality of life. It may be because we are, or we know, people who are unemployed and thus have a first-hand appreciation of the economic and psychological consequences of not having a job. Or it may be because we're concerned about the impact on our environment and our planet of our current approaches to work and employment. Whatever the reason, and there are many others, my experience over the past few years has been that an increasing number of people across the world are concerned about the world of work in which they live and which they will bequeath to their children. In my own case, coming to terms with this concern meant seriously questioning many of the assumptions which underpinned the way in which my life had developed. I began to notice a number of tensions in my own life. My job, which was supposed to provide the wherewithal to create and enjoy my life, was taking up so much time and energy that I didn't seem to have any other life. After reaching the executive suite in less than 10 years in a corporation making record profits for most of the 1980s, the 1990s were a bit of a shock. Employee numbers were reduced by 50% in 8 years, and many of those who had been my mentors and role models had gone, well before they'd planned to retire. Most of them have never had a full-time job again. Despite regular pay increases, the money that I was earning seemed to be disappearing faster than I could earn it. House extensions had also extended the mortgage. Unpredictable hours meant more and more expensive restaurant meals. Keeping up with the neighbours meant a flashy second car and paying someone else to clean the house. And little time with growing children meant childcare fees and expensive tutors. I began to wonder how I'd be able to provide for myself in my own retirement. My parents both died around their 60th birthdays, and I realised that I hadn't learnt as much from them as I felt I needed. I began to wonder what my children would learn from me. The community of which I'd been a part for more than 20 years began to change. Small local shops disappeared, and those which remained installed security shutters and alarms. My cherished Saturday morning walks to the shops with my children and 2 dogs now take half the time. There's virtually no one left on the streets to talk with anymore. I finally resolved many of these tensions for myself 4 years ago by resigning from the corporate world altogether. At the time, quitting seemed the only way in which I could regain a sense of control over my life. I've spent much of the past 4 years exploring how others might be helped to regain the same sense of control without necessarily feeling compelled to make such a huge change in their lives. In order to regain this control, I've realised we all need to look again at an interlinked series of assumptions we make about how the world operates. We take it for granted, for example, that life is inevitably divided into 2 parts: work, which you do for someone else in exchange for money, and not work, where you choose what you do and spend the money you earn at work. Work is where you produce, we believe, and not work is where you consume. Getting a good job is the ultimate goal of our lives. Without this, we cannot be independent. Without a good job, we cannot provide for ourselves and for those we love and care for. We were brought up to see this distinction very clearly. Our fathers had a job, and each week they brought home their paycheck, which they then handed over to our mothers, who spent it as part of their home duties. I'm not at all sure our mothers saw the distinction quite as clearly as we might like to believe. In fact, much of the feminist movement has been a perfectly understandable reaction to the notion that women's work did not create anything of value, it only consumed value created elsewhere. Today, women's voices would be swelled by many ecologists, economists and others who would point out just how highly selective are our current definitions of production and consumption. To take just a few examples, cleaning up after an ecological disaster, such as Exxon Valdez in Alaska, or making nuclear weapons, is considered productive. Children learning to read and write is not. Rebuilding houses burned by fire is productive. Clearing fire breaks around your home to prevent your house from being burnt down is not. Production is measured through economic statistics such as the gross domestic product, or GDP, which make these sorts of distinctions between what constitutes production and what doesn't. The power of this distinction is evidenced by the lengths to which governments at all levels are prepared to go to support and nurture corporations which promise to create productive jobs in their area. In an extensive series of articles from late in 1998, Time magazine quantified the millions of dollars in grants, subsidies and concessions given every day to corporations by county, state and federal governments in the USA. And the same pattern can be observed in all countries. But it's particularly evident in so-called developing countries, where aid, loans and national standing are all provided in direct proportion to the perceived job-creating capacity of the national economy. That same series of articles pointed out that all too often the promised jobs fail to appear, and even when they did, the cost of creating them was hugely excessive. Despite the implications of these articles, they're unlikely to lead to any significant change, because this behaviour supports our shared perception that it's corporations and businesses that create value and wealth, and that our part of that wealth is then captured by those who work there in the form of wages. This wealth is then distributed through taxation and government payments and in families throughout society. Activities considered consumption are left to compete for whatever resources they can eke out of governments, corporations or individuals. No matter how important we might feel our families or communities are, we can't see any way in which we could sustain ourselves by concentrating our activities there. It is changing this perception that is at the heart of seeing our lives and our work in a different way. But first, I need to say something more about corporations and businesses. I am not suggesting that corporations and businesses do not create wealth. In fact, the wealth of corporations is very visible and impressive. Corporations are responsible for most of the innovations and technologies which make life in the 1990s safer, more secure and more pleasant for most of us than at any time in human history. And it is the wealth and power of multinational corporations which is spreading these benefits across the world. However, something is lost when corporations pursue profits and returns to a small group of shareholders to the exclusion of their multiplicity of other stakeholders, as they have increasingly been doing over the past 20 years. It seems to me that there are two relatively simple changes which could be made to corporate structure and operation, which would avoid much of the human damage they currently cause. First, and paramount, would be a realignment of values to recognise that those who only offer their money to a corporation, in other words, institutional and private shareholders, are in fact making the lowest, not the highest, level of contribution. Those who bring themselves, their hearts, their brains, their lives and their livelihoods, these are employees, suppliers, customers and those who live in the neighbourhood, are bringing much more than money, a fact which deserves much more recognition in corporate accounting and decision making. Some people call this the triple bottom line, meaning the inclusion of social and human objectives as well as financial profit into business goals. Others talk of the social responsibility of business. I simply say that it's about time we take the time to identify those whose contribution to business deserves our greatest attention and hence warrants the largest allocation of resources. Second, the relatively recent notion of the enduring or long-term corporation deserves re-examination. The idea that a corporation has a legal identity which transcends its employees makes good sense in many circumstances. But its extension to a belief that this confers on the corporation an enduring right to continue to exist has, in my opinion, caused and continues to cause much damage. Incredible amounts of money have been wasted, and many otherwise immoral, unethical and ecologically disastrous decisions have been made in support of ailing corporations, which, in my view, would have been better allowed to simply die and disappear. One very simple example has to do with the economic concept of economy of scale, which has been used to justify everything from the growth of multinational corporations to the World Trade Organization and the Multilateral Agreement on Investment. In the early days of this century, human technology was sufficiently crude that there were large economies to be gained through long, continuous, unchanging production runs for products as diverse as motor vehicles and business shirts. As we enter the 21st century, the know-how and technology to make virtually anything is widely available to anyone who wants it, and the viable scale of production has been returned to a size not much bigger than suburban garages. The economies of scale of the next century will be demand-based. Who has the largest customer base? Not supply-based. Who has the largest factory? Successful corporations are already realizing that they will only survive in the future if they're perceived by their customers as adding value. Only our collective belief that corporations are the only real wealth creation vehicles in our society can justify decisions to pump huge resources into otherwise sinking corporate vessels. As I said at the beginning of this presentation, employment, by which I mean doing something someone else wants you to do in exchange for money, is only one way of getting work done. In fact, even in the most developed countries in the world, more work is done outside employment than inside it. Many governments, notably Canada, now include estimates of what is often called the household economy into their economic statistics. And these regularly show that the dollar value of work done outside the formal jobs market easily exceeds a country's GDP. It's my view that it's the meeting of people's needs which really constitutes the creation of wealth. And it seems to me that there is not now and has never been any shortage of unmet human needs. I suspect many of you would agree with me that there's much more to be done in this world than is currently being done. You might even wish to do some of this yourself rather than the things you currently do. However, to repeat something I said a few minutes ago, no matter how important we might feel our families or communities are, we can't see any way in which we could sustain ourselves by concentrating our activities there. Before I attempt to say more about how we might see and do things differently, I'd like to briefly comment on one more unquestioned assumption about the way in which the world of work operates. We also assume that adult life is inevitably divided into two phases: a working phase, in which we'll be productive and create wealth, and a retirement phase, in which we'll not be productive, but will rather consume the surplus wealth we created in our earlier years. Well, once this distinction might have made sense. When work was a largely physical activity, it made sense to stop working when the strain on the physical body became too great. As the world enters the 21st century, however, work is a largely intellectual activity,